Welcome, friends. You remember the boy with the high voice and the sailor hat, don't you? You recall the bright colors and the quest for a mountain of sugar. But memory is a treacherous thing, smoothing over the jagged edges of trauma until only a soft, palatable lie remains. The truth of Stormalong Harbor was never broadcast on your Saturday morning screens. It was too wet, too visceral, and far too cruel for the eyes of the innocent. We are not here to visit a magical dock, but to witness the autopsy of a childhood consumed by a parasitic rot. This is not a story of adventure, but a case study in how a human soul is systematically dismantled piece by bloody piece until the victim becomes the monster. The harbor itself was a festering wound on the face of the ocean, a quarantined purgatory floating in a dead, stagnant sea. It didn't smell of sea salt and adventure. It reeked of ancient bile, rusted metal, and the cloying, sweet stench of decomposition. Massive wooden beams, slick with black algae, groaned under the weight of accumulated filth, sounding like the moans of dying men trapped beneath the floorboards. The mist that clung to the docks wasn't atmospheric fog, but a miasma of bacterial spores that coated the throat and tasted of copper and ash. Here, the sun didn't shine. It bruised the sky with a sickly, jaundiced yellow, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to grab at your ankles, dragging you down into the muck where things slithered unseen in the dark. In the center of this industrial nightmare lived Flapjack, a boy whose mind was fracturing under the weight of his reality. He was small, malnourished, and desperate, a raw nerve ending seeking a connection in a world designed to sever them. To survive the horror of his daily existence, his psyche had constructed a terrifyingly beautiful filter. He saw the blackened gore of the docks as shimmering syrup, the rust as crystallized sugar, and the vermin as playful companions. It was a dissociative delusion, a desperate painting over of a gray, rotting canvas. He laughed when he should have screamed, his giggles echoing off the metal walls like the chime of a broken music box, unaware that his wide-eyed optimism was the very thing that made him such a delectable meal for the predator standing beside him. That predator wore the skin of a mentor, a creature named Captain Knuckles, who was less a man and more a collection of necrotic tissue held together by sheer malice. His skin was the color of a drowned corpse, a mottled, cyanotic blue that felt cold and clammy to the touch, sweating a mixture of brine and cheap synthetic sugar. He smelled of deep-sea decay and gangrene, a scent that Flapjack had been brainwashed to interpret as adventure. Knuckles moved with a stiff, unnatural gait, his wooden limbs grinding against raw bone with a wet, splintering sound that made the stomach turn. He fed the boy candy, a thick, narcotic sludge distilled from the harbor's toxic runoff, keeping Flapjack's eyes wide and his mind pliable, readying the child for the surgery that was always, inevitably, coming. The nightmare began in earnest on a Tuesday that smelled of ozone and dried blood. Knuckles, his eyes yellow with addiction, leaned close, his breath hot and rancid against Flapjack's face. He whispered of the Candied Island, claiming the map was etched into the skin of a sailor drowned beneath the pier. Desperate to please his father figure, Flapjack didn't hesitate. He dove into the oily, opaque black water, blind to the jagged metal debris lurking below. He surfaced moments later, clutching a patch of flayed skin, but the price was paid in red. A rusted pipe had sliced his arm open, exposing the white of the bone. Yet, Knuckles didn't panic. He stared at the wound with a terrifying, hungry excitement, his wooden fingers twitching as he offered to fix the boy with a rusty needle and a piece of driftwood he pulled from the garbage. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screaming metal and tearing gristle. Flapjack didn't experience the surgery as a medical procedure. He experienced it as a brutal act of carpentry performed on living tissue. There was no anesthesia, only a dirty rag shoved between his teeth, tasting of motor oil and saliva. He felt the rusty needle pierce his skin, sewing the jagged flaps of flesh together with the grace of a butcher stitching a sack of meat. But the true horror came with the hammer. He felt the vibrations travel up his skeletal structure, shaking his teeth in his skull, as Knuckles drove a piece of salt-rotted driftwood directly into the marrow of his severed stump. The pain was a blinding white light that shattered his vision, forcing his mind to retreat into the deepest, darkest corners of his consciousness to escape the agony of his own modification. When consciousness finally clawed its way back, it brought with it a feverish, throbbing heat that radiated from his shoulder. Flapjack opened his eyes, his vision swimming in a haze of sweat and grime. He looked down, expecting to see a bandage, perhaps a cast. Instead, he saw the grotesque fusion of biology and debris. His arm was gone, replaced by a jagged, splintered log that had been violently jammed into the open wound. The skin around the insertion point was angry and swollen, weeping a mixture of yellow pus and clear fluid, rejecting the foreign object that was now a permanent part of his anatomy. Rusty nails, bent and corroded, acted as crude staples, holding the wood in place against the trembling, traumatized flesh. Knuckles loomed over him, his silhouette twitching with a manic energy. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered validation wrapped in insanity. "Look at you," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "You look like a real adventurer now, boy." He framed the mutilation as a rite of passage, a necessary sacrifice to toughen the boy up for the rigors of the Candy Island. For a moment, Flapjack wanted to believe him. The desperate child inside him, starving for approval, tried to force a smile, tried to see the wooden stump as a badge of honor rather than a crippling injury. He tried to overlay the candy filter onto the wound, imagining the pus as vanilla cream and the blood as strawberry syrup. But the filter was glitching. The pain was too sharp, the smell of infection too potent to be fully masked by his delusion. For a split second, the bright, saturated colors of his fantasy world flickered and died, replaced by the desaturated, gritty reality of the harbor. He looked up at Knuckles, and the pirate wasn't a lovable rogue. He was a composite monster, a Frankenstein's monster of stolen parts. Flapjack's eyes widened in horror as he focused on Knuckles' left arm. It wasn't just a random limb. The skin tone was lighter, fresher, the fingers small and delicate. It was Flapjack's own severed arm, crudely stitched onto the captain's rotting torso to replace a piece of himself that had fallen away. A scream died in Flapjack's throat, choked off by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Knuckles wasn't healing him. He was harvesting him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't a partner, he was a spare parts depot, a living organ bank being kept fresh until the captain needed a new liver, a new eye, a new patch of skin. The candy he had been fed was just a preservative, a chemical agent to keep his meat sweet and his mind foggy. The love he thought he felt was the affection a parasite feels for its host. Panic, cold and primal, flooded his veins, overriding the lingering effects of the narcotic sludge. He had to get out. He had to run. Flapjack scrambled backward, his new wooden limb clattering clumsily against the metal floor. Knuckles lunged, his movements jerky and predatory, his wooden legs scraping against the iron. "Where are you going, boy?" he growled, the facade of mentorship dropping to reveal the hunger beneath. "We haven't finished the procedure." Flapjack didn't answer. He threw himself through the heavy iron door, tumbling out onto the chaotic, refuse-strewn docks. The air outside was thick with the smell of dead fish and diesel, but to Flapjack, it smelled like a fleeting chance at survival. He ran, his breath tearing at his lungs, his balance thrown off by the heavy, dead weight attached to his shoulder. He needed safety. He needed a sanctuary where the nightmare couldn't reach him. His mind instantly went to Bubby. She was his home, his mother, the great whale who had always sheltered him from the cruelties of the world. She would protect him. She would swallow him up and keep him safe in her warm, soft belly until the bad man went away. He sprinted toward the edge of the pier where her massive, bulbous form bobbed in the dark water. "Bubby!" he screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Open up! Please, open up!" The great mouth creaked open, not with a welcoming smile, but with the wet, suctioning sound of a biological valve releasing pressure. Flapjack didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the pink, fleshy cavern of her mouth, sliding down the wet, mucus-slicked tongue. He curled up in the darkness, waiting for the soothing voice of his mother to tell him everything would be all right. He waited for the feeling of safety to wash over him, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim, red light, the comfort never came. Instead, a wave of nausea rolled over him. The air inside wasn't warm. It was hot, humid, and heavy with the scent of hydrochloric acid and digesting meat. The floor beneath him pulsed rhythmically, not with the gentle beat of a heart, but with the violent contractions of a stomach preparing to purge. For the first time, Flapjack truly looked at his home. The furniture he had known all his life, the soft chairs, the bouncy bed, were not objects. They were cysts, large, fluid-filled sacs growing out of the stomach lining, throbbing with infection. The walls were not smooth skin. They were covered in ulcers and weeping sores. He touched the wall, and his hand came away covered in a thick, acidic slime that burned his fingertips. This was not a house. This was a biological prison. He looked up, searching for Bubby's face, for her eyes, but he saw only the dark, ribbed ceiling of a gullet. Horror dawned on him with agonizing slowness. Bubby wasn't a magical, talking whale. She was a colossal, mindless organism, a genetic abomination kept alive by a network of rusty, dripping tubes that penetrated her flesh from the outside, pumping nutrient slurry directly into her veins. She didn't speak. The voice he heard was just the groaning of gas escaping her fermenting digestive tract, which his broken mind had interpreted as words of love. He had been living inside a stomach, slowly being digested by enzymes disguised as affection. The safety he sought was a trap more absolute than the docks. He scrambled back toward the opening, his boots slipping on the slick, churning flesh. "Let me out!" he shrieked, pounding his wooden fist against the rows of baleen that barred the exit. "Bubby, please!" But there was no Bubby to hear him. The massive jaws began to close, the teeth locking together with a final bone-jarring thud. The light from the outside world was extinguished, leaving him in total, suffocating darkness. The sound of the ocean was replaced by the gurgling, wet sounds of his own impending digestion. The acid levels were rising, the heat intensifying, cooking him alive in the dark. Then, a match flared in the darkness. The sudden light blinded him for a moment. As his eyes adjusted, he saw the face of Captain Knuckles floating in the gloom, illuminated by the flickering flame. He was already inside. He had been waiting. The captain sat on a pile of rotting debris, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with the tremors of withdrawal. He looked like a cornered rat, shivering and sweating, his composure entirely gone. "She won't open, Flapjack," Knuckles whispered, his voice trembling, not without energy. "She's hungry. We're all hungry." The air in the stomach was running out, replaced by toxic fumes. Knuckles held up a glass jar, the contents glowing with a faint, eerie luminescence. "We need to give her the energy to open the mouth," he lied, his desperation making him sloppy. "And you need the energy to survive the exit." He thrust the jar toward Flapjack. "Eat. It's the purest candy. It's the only way out." Flapjack looked at the jar. It wasn't candy. Even through his fracturing delusion, he could see the truth. The substance was gray, lumpy, and suspended in a thick, gelatinous fluid. It was gray matter, crystallized brain tissue, chunks of spinal marrow. It was the remains of the previous adventurers, the other boys Knuckles had mentored, harvested, and consumed. This was the end result of the process, the distillation of youth and vitality into a consumable paste. "Eat it!" Knuckles roared, his voice cracking into a predator's snarl. He smashed the jar against the wall, scooping up a handful of the gray sludge. "Eat it, or we both die in here. Do you want to die in the dark, boy? Do you want to be nothing?" Flapjack wept, the tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. He looked at the sludge, then at his wooden arm, then at the monster who claimed to be his father. The choice was not between life and death. It was between dying as a human or surviving as a monster. The acid burned his feet. The air burned his lungs. The terror was absolute. His will, already fractured by years of gaslighting and abuse, finally shattered. He opened his mouth, a silent scream of surrender, and let Knuckles shove the handful of necrotic matter onto his tongue. The texture was revolt, gritty, slimy, with hard bits of bone that crunched between his teeth. It tasted of copper, old pennies, and the deep, bitter rot of the grave. He gagged, his body trying to reject the cannibalistic offering, but Knuckles clamped a hand over his mouth, forcing him to swallow. "Good boy," the captain whispered, his eyes gleaming with madness. "Swallow it down. Let it make you strong." Flapjack swallowed. He felt the cold, heavy lump slide down his throat, settling in his stomach like a stone. Almost immediately, the sensation began. It wasn't a rush of energy, but a spreading numbness. A cold anesthesia radiated from his core, silencing the pain in his stump, dulling the burning of the acid on his skin. The panic that had been screaming in his mind was suddenly silenced, replaced by a hollow, ringing void. He looked at his hands. In the flickering light of the match, the skin seemed to lose its pink, healthy hue, a tint of cyanotic blue. The color of a drowned corpse began to creep up his fingertips, spreading like ink in water. He looked at Knuckles, and the fear was gone. The revulsion was gone. The candy had done its work. It had killed the part of him that could feel horror. It had killed the child. Flapjack wiped the gray residue from his lips, and for the first time in his life, he didn't smile. His face went slack, his eyes dead and flat, reflecting the empty darkness of the belly. He felt a new hunger rising within him, a craving not for sweets, but for survival at any cost. "More," Flapjack whispered, his voice changing. It was no longer high and piping. It had dropped an octave, raspy and wet, mimicking the timbre of the captain. "I need more." Knuckles grinned, revealing his rotting teeth, and handed the boy the rest of the jar. Flapjack ate with mechanical efficiency, shoveling the remains of the dead into his mouth, fueling his own transformation. The tears had stopped. There was no more crying in Stormalong Harbor. There was only the hunger, and the wood, and the blue rot taking hold. The descent was complete. The bottom had been reached, and in the darkness of the whale's stomach, a new monster was being born. The chemical slush of the purest candy hit Flapjack's brain like a sledgehammer, shattering the last vestiges of objective reality. The damp, suffocating interior of the whale dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors. He was no longer in a dying stomach. He was standing at the gates of the West, the final barrier to the candied island. But the gatekeeper was a beast of rotting wood and jealousy. Knuckles, now fully succumbing to his own parasitic desperation, lunged. He didn't see a boy anymore. He saw a collection of viable organs, a fresh liver, strong kidneys, wet lungs, that could extend his own wretched expiration date by another week. He tackled Flapjack, his wooden hands closing around the boy's throat, squeezing with the hysterical strength of a dying addict. "I made you!" Knuckles shrieked, spittle flying. "You owe me this! "You owe me your life," Flapjack gagged, the pressure crushing his windpipe, but he didn't feel fear. The gray matter he had consumed was firing neurons in a pattern of pure, unadulterated violence. In his hallucination, he wasn't being strangled. He was wrestling a candy cane guardian who was trying to keep him from his prize. His survival instinct, now rewired by cannibalism, took over. He swung his new arm. The crude, wooden log key knuckles had hammered into his shoulder with feral intensity. The heavy timber connected with the side of Knuckles' head, producing a sound that was less like a crack and more like a wet thud, like striking a rotten pumpkin with a baseball bat. Knuckles staggered back, his grip loosening, a look of genuine confusion crossing his decomposing face. The fight that followed was a clumsy, visceral brawl in the dark, illuminated only by the dying flare of the match. It wasn't a heroic duel of swords. It was two monsters hacking at each other in the mud. Flapjack struck again and again, his wooden limb acting as a bludgeon. He smashed Knuckles' prosthetic legs, shattering the brittle, worm-eaten wood. He drove his fist into the captain's chest, feeling the rib cage give way like wet cardboard. Knuckles clawed at him, tearing strips of blue skin from Flapjack's face. But the boy felt no pain, only the euphoric rush of the candy coursing through his veins. He was fixing the world. He was removing the obstacle. He was being an adventurer. Knuckles fell, his body a broken heap of debris and flesh. He looked up at his creation, his one good eye wide with a final terrifying realization. The parasite had successfully cultivated a predator. "Flapjack," he wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips, dark and thick like molasses. "Don't leave me." Flapjack stood over him, breathing heavily, the sound echoing in the fleshy chamber. He didn't see a dying man. He saw a pile of rock candy that needed to be cleared from the path. With a blank, serene expression, Flapjack raised his wooden arm one last time and brought it down, crushing the skull of the man who had been his father, his tormentor, and his architect. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the dripping of stomach acid. With the guardian destroyed, the path was clear. Flapjack turned his gaze upward, toward the row of baleen plates that barred the exit. In his mind, they were gates of white chocolate. In reality, they were bone and cartilage, locked tight in rigor mortis. He climbed the soft, folding tissue of the throat, digging his fingers into the ulcers to find purchase. He reached the teeth and began to hack. He pounded against the bone, splintering the enamel, tearing at the gums until his hands were raw and bleeding. He screamed as he worked, a war cry of madness and triumph, breaking the mouth of the whale from the inside out. Sunlight, blinding and cruel, began to pierce the darkness, slicing through the gloom like a knife. He burst through the shattered teeth, tumbling out into the open air. The brightness was searing, burning his retinas after the gloom of the belly. He gasped, sucking in lungfuls of salt air, but the air was stale, carrying the scent of stagnation. Flapjack pulled himself up, standing on the floating carcass of Bubby. He wiped the blood and gray slime from his eyes and looked out at the horizon. A wide, beatific smile stretched across his face, pulling at the stitches of his scars. "I found it," he whispered, his voice trembling with joy. "The candied island, it's beautiful." In his mind, the ocean was a sea of lemonade, sparkling under a sugar-spun sun. The debris floating in the water was composed of gumdrops and marshmallows. And there, in the distance, was the island, a towering mountain of rock candy and chocolate streams, promising eternal sweetness and safety. He saw the Lollipop Guild waving to him. He saw the Peppermint Palace. He saw a paradise that justified every amputation, every trauma, every piece of his soul he had fed to the darkness. The delusion was complete, a perfect, impenetrable shield against the horror of his existence. He laughed, a high, broken sound that drifted over the water. But the camera of our mind's eye pulls back, stripping away the filter of his madness to reveal the objective truth. There is no lemonade sea. The ocean is dead, a flat, gray expanse of water choked with oil slicks and plastic waste. There is no sun, only the same bruised yellow sky hanging low over the world. And there is no island. Flapjack is staring at a dense fog bank, a wall of gray mist rising from the pollution. He is standing on the rotting, bloated corpse of a whale that has been dead for days, bobbing aimlessly in the middle of nowhere. The adventure has led him to a graveyard. And Flapjack himself? He is no longer the soft, round boy we knew. He is a skeletal figure, starved and ruined. His skin has turned entirely blue, the color of deep bruising and hypoxia, a side effect of the necrotic candy and the lack of oxygen. His nose has rotted away, leaving a dark, gaping cavity in the center of his face. His left arm is a jagged piece of driftwood, fused to his body by scar tissue and infection. He stands with a stoop, his spine twisted, his movements jerky and mechanical. He has not found the island. He has become the island's nightmare. He has become Captain Knuckles. The transformation is absolute. The cycle of abuse has not been broken. It has been perfected. Flapjack looks down at the garbage floating around the whale corpse. His eyes, now yellow and bloodshot, fixate on a clump of seaweed and a discarded plastic bottle. He reaches down, his wooden fingers clicking together, and scoops up the debris. With practiced, manic movements, he begins to twist the trash. He jams the seaweed into the bottle. He tears a piece of fabric from his own tattered shirt. He is making something. He is making a friend. He holds up the crude, dripping puppet. It looks nothing like a boy, but in Flapjack's shattered mind, it is a small, pink child with round eyes and a thirst for adventure. He sets the puppet on his knee, his wooden hand manipulating its head. "Welcome, little one," Flapjack rasps, his voice a perfect, gravelly imitation of the dead captain. "You look like you've got the makings of a great adventurer." He strokes the puppet's plastic head, a terrifying tenderness in his touch. "Don't worry about the smell. That's just the smell of victory." He leans in close to the garbage doll, his breath rattling in his chest. "I know a place," he whispers, the lie falling easily from his lips. "A poisonous inheritance passed down from father to son. A magical place made of candy. And I can take you there. But first, we need to toughen you up." He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a shard of rusty metal. "We need to fix you." The puppet stares back with empty plastic eyes, unable to scream, unable to run, destined to be the next course in the feast. The camera lingers on this tableau of madness. A blue, rotting monster, sitting on a dead whale in a dead ocean, talking to a piece of trash. The waves lap gently against the carcass, a soft, rhythmic sound that mimics a heartbeat. The fog rolls in, swallowing them whole, erasing them from the world. There is no hope here. There is no redemption. There is only the hunger, the delusion, and the eternal grinding machinery of trauma that turns victims into executioners. The story hasn't ended. It has simply reset. Now you know, friends. You know the texture of the candy. You know the cost of the map. You know that the monsters under the bed are not nearly as frightening as the monsters we create in the mirror. Stormalong Harbor was never a place. It was a condition, a terminal diagnosis of the soul. So the next time you taste something sweet, something that melts on your tongue and makes you forget your troubles, ask yourself, what was ground up to make it? And are you the one eating? Or are you the one being eaten? Sleep well.